Ich habe also die Aufgabe, hier einen Ausblick zu geben, und das versuche ich und mache es sehr gerne.
I was asked to offer a type of conclusion. We could see the extent of the topic and how broad it is, and we also looked at the perspectives, and I tried to figure out what I'd tell my 15-year-old son if I were to tell him why I was away for a long time. I think it makes sense to start from scratch, so to speak, and reconstruct the common good. Economists love to tell a story, and that's the Robinson Crusoe story. I mean, as long as he's alone on the island, there is probably no common good problem. But then Friday joins him, and then we do have the potential for a common good problem. But then you'd probably not talk about the state, the government, parliament, and decision-making processes, but rather about an exchange between two human beings. And we also know that the origin of wealth is about the division of labor. If you have more people, they can specialize. So we need to ask, first of all, how does wealth come into being? And we need to see trade and transactions, and the trade and transaction that happen between the two. Someone said trust hasn't been mentioned here. Well, indeed, and that's an important aspect, and I'm telling you this because in view of the diversity of meanings of common good, we need to remind ourselves that at the origin, at the onset, so to speak, of the common good, there is the creation of wealth. We've been reminded of the primary mission of enterprises, which is the production of products and services. And the production of wealth is nothing you could do alone. And that's maybe one of the problems of the economists, because they started focusing on the individual for a long time. But Adam Smith was right to remind us that wealth is being generated by means of the transaction and exchange. So we need to focus on exchange and on topics which are related to economic policy. Why does Trump say he doesn't want to have international exchange anymore, or less international trade? And what does this announcement mean for the production of wealth in global societies? I think we have to focus on these questions. And we need to focus on wealth, on health. How do we manage to have people not only provide of resources, but to be healthy? I think we need to consider the fundamentals, the basics, and the fundamental role of the common good in order to address the political questions. Let me mention some of the challenges we have to meet. Challenge number one: we are at risk because we might begin to forget that the common good is about the generation of wealth. We are often inclined to talk about how to save the planet, but these are not the priority issues, because we are about to destroy our wealth if we destroy the production or if we make it impossible to furthermore produce. The second challenge would be what I call the nanny state, because the state has become a welfare state of the worst kind. Hayek reminded us of the unlimited expansion of the welfare state, which is what we realized in the 1970s in a number of developing countries. And of course, the welfare state often had a positive impact, but often it was impossible to pay for the welfare state. Mr. Gochel also mentioned the minimum income. I think we do have major incentive problems here, and we learned in the 1970s already that we need to consider them. Then there were Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who became famous because she said there are neither a common good nor a society, or there is neither a common good nor a society. I wouldn't subscribe to this, but Reagan and Thatcher were definitely people who started to reduce the welfare state. Now, the welfare state has been replaced by a more subtle version of the welfare state, which is different because they do not go and nationalize enterprises anymore, but they use the principle of nudging. Normally, the government prescribes rules and regulations, but nudging works differently. Nudging is actually an approach which keeps or maintains the freedom of the individual who is nudged into a certain direction, like an app on your mobile phone, which shows you every day how much steps you made yesterday or how much refined sugar you had. I mean, that's what the industry is interested in. And the citizen, without him or her realizing, is being pushed into a given direction. Nudging is when you start a new job and realize that you are automatically registered, that you've automatically registered for a savings contract. And of course, you get a letter telling you that you can opt out if you want to. But 80% of the people are usually much too lazy and they never opt out. So if they are registered for a certain program, they stay with it. Advertising is another form of nudging. Advertising is made by enterprises. That's what we know. But do we want the government offer advertising? You could call it advertising or PR, but you can also call it manipulation. Do you want to be manipulated? I mean, who decides? Will parliaments decide about the publicity made by governments? I think this is a challenge to the common good. Actually, all these examples are challenges to the common good because the idea behind all these programs is changing human beings, the transformation of human beings. A similar doubtful idea is the unconditional minimum wage, which is also about a certain nanny attitude, because the idea is that there are lots of people who cannot make money anymore because of the digital challenges. So the government offers them freedom by making a minimum or a basic income available to them. But I think this is a double error, so to speak, maybe a very bourgeois, wrong perception or misconception. It's a double misconception. However, we need to bear in mind that it's first and foremost the bourgeoisie who offers the idea of basic income. But they are wrong because they believe that the bulk of the people works not for the purpose of making money. However, that's wrong. I mean, we tend to say, I wouldn't stop working if I earned less. So I'm not only interested in the money, but people are interested in the money. And the second era of fallacy actually is that the bulk of the people is like well-paid academics. So the bourgeoisie thinks that there will be paradise once there is the basic income for everybody. However, psychological studies show what happens to people who are just funded, who are not being taken care of anymore, who don't have to work anymore, who get, without any condition connected, a minimum income, a basic income. Now that's resignation, that's capitulation, that's about us giving up a major part of the population. So we need to be careful. And then there is a second challenge I would like to mention, and that's migration. Now, migration is the title. So we think we do not have to think about the common good here, only our common good, which is connected to the idea that we cannot build any walls. There needs to be migration. However, this triggers contradictions. If we want to preserve the welfare state, if we want to expand it, and if we want to offer the basic income, we'll trigger mass immigration, which means the more we move away from self-responsibility, the higher the walls will be, however. So we cannot have both. And people tend to underestimate the problem we need to see with respect to migration and the walls. And then the third challenge, that's Kantian economic policy. That's a specifically German problem. And we need to see the international context. I call it Kantian. What do I mean by it? In international negotiations, countries tend to protect their own interests. That's the duty of governments, normally. But in Germany, it's different. Let's take climate policy. The German government goes and says, we need to be a model. We need to set an example. The same goes for taxation. The German government goes and says, we need to set an example. We need to be a model case. Well, it sounds good indeed. However, doesn't a country undermine its own interests by arguing that way? The U.S. Congress talked about the coordination of taxation so that national companies stop evading tax payments. And a letter was written to the Minister of Finance, according to which the minister was reminded of the fact that the idea is well and good, but the Minister of Finance in the U.S., the Secretary of the Treasury, must represent exclusively the interests of the United States of America, whereas in Germany nobody really wonders or asks what the interests of the German government or of the country are. I mean, it's important to be interested in global interests. However, in Germany, we have a much more excessive approach. And as Kai Conrad said, there are less and less contributions made to the common good. So I think legitimate interests of a nation need to be represented by the nation. Now, we are also dealing with growing populations and an increasing homogeneity across nations, which might make it difficult to agree across nations, and in particular to support one's own country. If there is more similarity between the countries, there is less interest in supporting one's own. The fifth challenge is the global scale with respect to taxation and standards and other fields. People argue that the nation state cannot do much. The economy is a global one, but there is no global policy. They say that's true. However, the solution won't be a global government. We tend to think that if there was a global government, it would do what we want it to do. However, the global government could also be a Chinese one. So I think it makes sense to have checks and balances. The support of powerful global organizations is costly, and thus checks and balances are extremely important. We have powerful nations like the US and China, but Donald Trump is not ruling the world, and the Communist Party of China doesn't rule the world either. So it makes sense to try and prevent certain individual solutions in the field of the climate, for example. Now, the last challenge I would like to mention refers to the opportunities I see, and that's about digitization and the possibility of communication across urban, regional, national boundaries. In the 1990s, I traveled to Argentina, to Cordoba, a city in a rural area, and I went to church. There was the local cathedral, and I went there because I had a bit of time, and I realized that what this church service was about was that it was a global phenomenon, because those people in the church in Cordoba at the time were part of a global community. Today, we are no longer impressed by the existence of global communities. For us, it's very normal to talk to our relatives in Europe, in China, wherever. There is a global exchange. There is global communication, and that's a major opportunity. That's what we know from the sciences and from many enterprises. In the past, you had to write letters, and you had to wait for an answer 4 weeks. Today, this happens within minutes. And that's a major chance for us for the future, and it also prevents lots of bad things from happening. Conflicts, wars, are much more difficult to imagine today because we can talk. I mean, communication is not a guarantee that there are no wars and conflicts, but it makes it easier to live without conflicts and wars, and that's why I'm seeing it as an opportunity. What will come out of it? I would like to quote Willy Brandt. The best way of predicting the future is making the future. That's certainly a quote you all know, ladies and gentlemen. The future is open, and we need to shape the future of the common good. That's clearly an invitation, a call for us. And we had some time and opportunity to ponder this question, to reflect, and that's why I would like to thank you once again, dear Corinne Flick.